Imagine a world ruled by kings and empires, where freedom was a fantasy whispered only in taverns and meeting halls. A world where the might of the British Empire stretched across the oceans, unchallenged and unbreakable. Then from across the Atlantic, 13 small colonies dared to defy it. They had no navy, no money, and no professional army. Yet they rose to fight the most powerful nation on earth. If you want to see more stories that shaped history, from the rise and fall of empires to the revolutions that changed the world, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love history. Together, we keep history alive. For 6 brutal years, the war raged. Cities burned, families starved, and soldiers froze through winters with no boots, no food, and no pay. But in the fall of 1781, everything would change. On the quiet banks of the York River, in a small Virginia town, the fate of the Revolution and the dream of America itself would be decided. This is the story of the Siege of Yorktown, the battle that ended an empire and gave birth to a nation. In the autumn of 1781, on the quiet shores of the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, the destiny of an entire continent hung in the balance. What began as a rebellion of 13 colonies against a distant king was about to reach its defining moment, the Siege of Yorktown. It was a clash of empires, of ideals, and of perseverance, a battle that would decide whether the dream of American independence would survive or die forever. To understand Yorktown, one must return to the beginning, to the long, bitter years of the American Revolutionary War. Since 1775, the struggle between Britain and her rebellious colonies had raged without mercy. From the first shots at Lexington and Concord to the frozen suffering of Valley Forge, the war had tested every fiber of America's resolve. The British Empire, unmatched in power, wealth, and naval strength, had every reason to believe the rebellion would be crushed quickly. Its armies had conquered half the world. Its red-coated soldiers were feared across continents. Yet the Americans' farmers, tradesmen, and volunteers refused to yield. Under the leadership of George Washington, the Continental Army fought not for conquest, but for an idea that men could govern themselves, free of a king's tyranny. Washington's army endured defeats at New York, Brandywine, and Germantown, but it also won crucial victories at Trenton, where Washington's daring Christmas night crossing of the Delaware revived American morale, and at Saratoga, where the capture of an entire British army convinced France to join the war on America's side. By 1780, however, the revolution was in peril once more. The war had become a stalemate. The British held New York City, and their forces dominated much of the South. The Continental Congress struggled to pay soldiers. Inflation ravaged the economy. Mutinies and desertions spread. And yet, amid exhaustion and despair, Washington never lost faith. His vision was clear: one decisive victory could end the war. The chance to achieve it would not come easily. For years, the British avoided a final confrontation, choosing instead to wear the Americans down. But in 1781, fate and British miscalculation would change everything. In 1780, Britain shifted its focus to the south. Believing the southern colonies were full of loyalists eager to return to royal rule, London hoped to crush the rebellion there and then move north. General Charles Cornwallis was given command of this campaign. A skilled and confident officer, Cornwallis won major victories at Charleston and Camden, capturing thousands of American troops. For a time, it seemed the British were unstoppable, but the South proved far less loyal than they imagined. Local militias rose up, using guerrilla tactics to harass British supply lines. Leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and Nathaniel Greene waged relentless hit-and-run warfare, bleeding Cornwallis's forces day by day. Greene famously wrote, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." It was not about winning battles. It was about surviving long enough for the British to exhaust themselves. Cornwallis's victories came at a high cost. His army grew thinner, his supply lines longer. Pursued by Greene and threatened by local resistance, he marched his troops north into Virginia, seeking a position to rest and refit a decision that would prove fatal. By mid-1781, Cornwallis selected Yorktown, Virginia, as his base. Yorktown seemed an ideal choice. Located on the York River, It provided access to the Chesapeake Bay, perfect for receiving supplies or reinforcements from the British Navy. Cornwallis began building defensive lines, fortifying the town with earthen redoubts and artillery placements. He believed that if attacked, the Royal Navy could sail up the Chesapeake to evacuate or support him. But hundreds of miles away, George Washington planned that would turn Yorktown into a trap. At the time, Washington was encamped outside New York City, facing the British Commander-in-Chief, General Henry Clinton. For years, he had dreamed of retaking New York, but the British defenses were too strong. Then came an opportunity brought by America's French allies. General Jean-Baptiste de Rochambeau, commanding 4,000 French troops in Rhode Island, and Admiral François de Grasse, leading a powerful fleet in the Caribbean, proposed a bold plan: strike Cornwallis in Virginia. If de Grasse could sail north and block the Chesapeake, while Washington and Rochambeau marched south to surround Yorktown by land, the British Army would be trapped, cut off from escape or reinforcement. It was a daring gamble, but after 6 years of blood and sacrifice, Washington was ready to risk everything on one decisive blow. In August 1781, he made his choice. The combined Franco-American army would march nearly 400 miles south to Virginia. Yorktown would be their target. Secrecy was vital. Washington knew British intelligence was watching every move. To deceive them, he ordered fake construction of siege equipment near New York, spreading rumors that Manhattan remained his true objective. Even many of his own officers did not know the real plan. On August 19, 1781, the march began. 7,000 American troops and 4,000 French soldiers crossed the Hudson River, beginning a grueling journey through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. The column stretched for miles, wagons creaking, horses snorting, drums beating a steady rhythm. Dust rose along the roads as soldiers trudged southward under the late summer sun. For Washington, the march was both a logistical challenge and a test of morale. Food was scarce, roads were rough, and many soldiers were barefoot. But the spirit of the army was unbreakable. Civilians gathered along the roads, waving flags and offering bread, cider, and blessings. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress greeted Washington's army as heroes. The city that had once declared independence now saw the very men fighting to make that declaration a reality. The French troops, disciplined and immaculate in their blue and white uniforms, impressed the American crowds. The Americans, lean and hardened from years of struggle, earned the respect of their allies. As they marched, Washington remained outwardly calm, but inside his anxiety grew. Everything depended on timing and on Admiral de Grasse's success at sea. If the French fleet arrived too late, the British Navy could rescue Cornwallis. If de Grasse were defeated, all would be lost. The fate of the revolution now depended not on land, but on the waters of the Chesapeake Bay. In late August, Admiral de Grasse arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake with 28 ships of the line, one of the most powerful naval forces France had ever sent to the Americas. At nearly the same time, the British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves sailed from New York to intercept him. On September 5, 1781, the two fleets met in what became known as the Battle of the Capes. For hours, the Chesapeake roared with cannon fire. Masts splintered, decks burned, and hundreds of sailors were killed or wounded. Though neither side suffered catastrophic losses, the British were ultimately forced to withdraw. Strategically, it was a decisive French victory. The Chesapeake was now under French control. No British ships could reach Yorktown. Cornwallis was completely cut off. As de Grasse held the bay, Washington's army crossed the Potomac and entered Virginia. The trap was closing. By late September, Washington, Rochambeau, and Lafayette united their forces. The young Marquis de Lafayette, who had been shadowing Cornwallis for months, was overjoyed to see his mentor again. On September 28, 1781, the combined Franco-American army, over 17,000 strong, surrounded Yorktown. Cornwallis's 8,000 British and German troops, though disciplined and brave, were now hopelessly outnumbered and isolated. Washington inspected the ground himself, choosing sites for trenches, artillery, and camps. To him, this was more than a military operation, it was destiny. At long last, the revolution had brought him to the threshold of victory. By September 28, 1781, the Allied forces had completed their encirclement of Yorktown. The town itself was small, a modest port settlement along the York River, surrounded by gentle slopes, open fields, and low ravines. Cornwallis's army had constructed two defensive lines, an outer ring of redoubts and trenches, and an inner line protecting the town itself. The British commander had hoped for reinforcements from the sea, but when word reached him that the French fleet had taken control of the Chesapeake, dread began to set in. The Atlantic, once his gateway to safety, had become a prison wall. Washington, meanwhile, wasted no time. He ordered his engineers to begin siege preparations immediately. Diately. The work was grueling. By day, Allied artillery bombarded the British positions. By night, soldiers and laborers dug trenches under cover of darkness. The French, trained in the art of European siege warfare, guided much of the operation. Their precision and discipline were crucial. Yet the Americans, driven by determination and experience from years of hardship, matched their allies in courage and endurance. It was a scene of relentless motion, thousands of men cutting through earth, laying down gabions, hauling cannons, and driving stakes. The trenches stretched across the fields like a great scar, inching closer to Yorktown with every passing night. By October 6th, the Allies had completed their first parallel, a line of trenches roughly 800 yards from the British defenses. The next step was to establish artillery positions along this line. Washington personally oversaw the placement of the first gun. It was a symbolic act, the commander-in-chief himself lighting the fuse that would signal the beginning of the end. When the first cannon fired, its deep thunder rolled across the Virginia landscape, echoing off the river and the surrounding hills. It was followed by another, then another, until the entire Allied line roared to life. For days, the bombardment continued without pause. French and American guns hurled thousands of shells into Yorktown. Buildings crumbled, ammunition wagons exploded, and the British soldiers huddled in shallow trenches, enduring the unending rain of iron. Civilians trapped in the town, merchants, servants, enslaved laborers, took shelter where they could. The night sky glowed red from the constant fire. The air smelled of smoke, sulfur, and scorched earth. Cornwallis wrote despairingly to General Clinton in New York, begging for relief. "If you cannot relieve me soon, you must prepare to hear the worst." As the bombardment continued, Washington ordered the digging of a second, closer parallel. To complete it, the Allies needed to capture two key British positions, redoubts 9 and 10. These small but heavily fortified earthworks guarded the British left flank and blocked access to Yorktown's inner defenses. If they fell, the Allied artillery could move even closer and deliver the final blow. Washington decided on a night assault. The French would attack Redoubt 9, the Americans would take Redoubt 10. On the evening of October 14, 1781, the air was still. The moon hung low behind thin clouds. The chosen assault parties, roughly 400 Americans and 400 French, assembled silently. Among the American force was a young officer named Alexander Hamilton, Washington's trusted aide-de-camp, eager for a chance to prove himself in direct combat. At Washington's signal, the attackers moved forward, muskets unloaded to avoid giving away their position with a spark. Bayonets glinted in the darkness. The Americans reached the redoubt's outer abattis, a barrier of sharpened logs, and hacked through it with axes and sabers. The British, realizing the danger, opened fire. The night erupted in chaos, shouts, flashes, smoke, and the screams of the wounded. But the momentum was unstoppable. Hamilton's men surged over the parapet, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Within 10 minutes, the redoubt was theirs. At the same moment, the French stormed Redoubt 9. Their fight was fierce and costly, but they too emerged victorious. The next morning, Washington surveyed the captured redoubts with quiet satisfaction. The path was now open for the final bombardment. By October 16th, the situation for Cornwallis had become hopeless. Allied artillery now stood less than 300 yards from his lines, their fire devastating every corner of the town. Cannonballs smashed through defenses, gunpowder magazines exploded, and morale plummeted. The British soldiers were exhausted, their rations dwindling. Horses lay dead in the streets, their carcasses covered in flies. Desperate, Cornwallis made one final attempt to escape. Under cover of darkness, He began ferrying his troops across the York River to Gloucester Point, intending to break through the French and American forces on the opposite shore. But nature intervened. A violent storm swept across the bay, scattering boats and capsizing barges. The crossing was abandoned. The next morning, Cornwallis faced the grim reality there was no way out. Surrounded by superior forces, bombarded without mercy, and with no hope of relief from Clinton's fleet, he made the inevitable decision. On October 17, a white flag appeared above the British lines. A drummer advanced toward the Allied positions, followed by an officer carrying a message of surrender. The guns fell silent. For the first time in weeks, the thunder of war gave way to an eerie calm. Negotiations took place over the next 2 days. Washington demanded full surrender of all British and German troops, along with their weapons and equipment. On the afternoon of October 19, 1781, the ceremony began. Unai. Dare a clear Virginia sky, the British Army marched out of Yorktown, drums beating, colors cased. Nearly 8,000 soldiers filed between lines of French and American troops who stood at attention. Cornwallis, claiming illness, did not attend. His second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, led the procession. Riding forward, O'Hara attempted to present Cornwallis's sword to Rochambeau, acknowledging the French contribution. But Rochambeau pointed to Washington. Washington, maintaining formality, directed O'Hara to deliver the sword instead to General Benjamin Lincoln, the same officer forced to surrender to the British at Charleston the previous year. It was a gesture filled with symbolism. The revolution had come full circle. As the British laid down their arms, the American band reportedly played the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." And indeed, for the British Empire, it had been. News of Yorktown spread with astonishing speed. Couriers carried the story north to Philadelphia, where celebrations erupted in the streets. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and Congress gave thanks to Washington, Rochambeau, and the French king for their victory. Across the Atlantic, the shock in London was profound. Parliament fell into chaos. Lord North, the British Prime Minister, is said to have exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over," when he received the news. Public opinion turned sharply against the war. After 6 costly years and tens of thousands of lives lost, the British people demanded peace. Though it would take 2 more years to formalize it, the American victory at Yorktown had broken Britain's will to fight. The Treaty of Paris and the birth of a nation. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the American Revolutionary War. Britain recognized the independence of the United States, ceding vast territories stretching to the Mississippi River. The 13 colonies had become a nation. For George Washington, Yorktown was both a triumph and a test of character. The victory made him the most celebrated man in America. Yet when the war ended, he did something unprecedented in history. He resigned his commission and returned to private life. Kings and conquerors of the past had always clung to power. Washington walked away from it. His humility astonished the world and cemented his legacy as a man of virtue as well as victory. For the French, the success at Yorktown was also a point of pride. Their soldiers and sailors had fought and died to help a new republic win its freedom. It was a powerful example of how international alliances could change the course of history. Yet within a decade, the same spirit of liberty that had driven the American Revolution would ignite in France itself, leading to the French Revolution. The Siege of Yorktown was not merely a military triumph, it was a turning point in human history. It proved that determination, unity, and conviction could defeat empire. The lessons of Yorktown echoed through generations. The ideals born on those battlefields, liberty, self-governance, and the belief that ordinary people could shape their own destiny, became the foundation of democratic movements around the world. The cannons that once roared at Yorktown are silent now, but their echoes still resound in the principles that define freedom today. Every revolution, every nation that has fought for independence since, carries a fragment of Yorktown's spirit. And for America, Yorktown was the moment of awakening when 13 struggling colonies became a single nation, united by sacrifice and by hope. The story of Yorktown is the story of how courage, strategy, and conviction can shape the fate of the world. From the farms of New England to the fields of Virginia, Ordinary men and women endured unimaginable hardship to secure a single, extraordinary dream freedom. The battle that ended at Yorktown did more than close a war. It opened an era. It proved that tyranny could be challenged, that unity could overcome empire, and that the pursuit of liberty would forever alter the course of history. Today, as we look back on those quiet Virginia shores, we remember the sacrifice of those who stood, fought, and fell there. Americans, Frenchmen, and countless others who believed that freedom was worth any price. The Siege of Yorktown was not just the end of the Revolutionary War. It was the beginning of the American story,